We are, of course, continuing our studies. We're in Genesis chapter 8. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to Jim for covering me last week. As those who were here will know, perhaps will know, my back was bothering me a bit last week, quite a lot, as a matter of fact. Hopefully that seems to be getting better, but still need to probably continue to do some stretching and strengthening of that. It's not a pleasant experience. But again, I appreciate Jim for covering the class. And the great thing about the subject we're doing is this is a subject Jim has taught previously, and so he was able to step right in. I know normally if we replace each other in a class, we normally don't try to keep up with the particular subject because the person is doing that. But in this case, I did mention to him about go ahead and covering material as he's taught this particular book before. And he said that you guys have gotten down to 13 and covered a little bit in 14. And hopefully that was very beneficial. In context, what are we seeing here? What's going on in Genesis chapter 8? Flood is, okay, the flood is over.
Recovery is.
In a sense, the flood is over, and actually we see, and what we're seeing here being described is as the waters, what, they start to recede, right? They're receding. We see here as we're going to continue tonight, we see what? We see the waters, they recede, and in fact dries up, right? So that's kind of the picture of that's a picture of what we're seeing here. This great flood that in fact occurs. And we see a time frame. And I don't know, Jim, did you cover, because this was really into your discussion last week, did you kind of cover the timeline of the days, or I don't know if you really talked about that last week? I mean, not a huge deal, but
We did to some extent, not totally, but one thing we hit last week that kind of surprised me about, in chapter 7, verse 11. No. 7 verse 20. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail and the mountains were covered. You know, God doesn't give us numbers just to be giving us that. Why did he put that in? Well, that people know that every before this discovery has been water, and with the water being up that high, there's nothing to survive.
Nobody, anybody's saying it was.
Yeah, there's more than that. At least to me, there's more than that. And that is because how much draft does that boat have?
it's not really, it's just sitting there.
How much draft does it have? You know what I mean about draft?
Was it moving?
No. How deep in the water?
Oh, I have no idea, but
Okay,
It would sit pretty
look
heavy.
at your dimensions of the ark. It's about 45 foot high. Most boats then, even today, are about half their depth underwater. The freeboard from the water line up is about the same as from the water line down. You have a total height of 45 foot. What's half of that?
22 and a half.
What's 15 cubits? I
I would have to figure out, estimating 18 inches, 18 times 15, whatever that is.
22,
I'd
23.
have to figure it out.
But this is showing us that the ark would not be stuck on any high mountain that was not totally covered.
That's fascinating to consider. Consider that. Of course, you know, as Bill mentioned, of course, you also keep in mind it would also finish off any
Oh, yeah.
land animals. Obviously, anything that swims and breathes in the water would not have a problem with that. So we see, but we see again the complete devastation that occurs. I want to share with you something that I was noting, actually in and his brother Stapleton's notes that he had. He asked the question, "Where are the corpses?" This is a little bit further ahead, and we're, again, I'm not going verse by verse here. This is in chapter 8 and specifically in there in well, running through verse 19. Where are the corpses? We think about all these people, all these animals. We think about the complete devastation. And again, if we consider the number of people, and I don't know, but it's estimated that there could have been as many as 6 million. I've seen some commentaries who suggest that there wouldn't have been even close to that now at this point because, you know, so wicked and they were killing themselves off. Basically, one commentator, I don't remember which one it was making this point. I don't necessarily agree with that thought, but there were certainly a lot of people at this time. You think of all these animals that were killed. Where is everything? Where did everything go, John?
Well, you got two things to think of. One, they're buried deep in the earth with also the mud. Two, we can look at the world today, volcanic ash, volcanic eruption in the ocean, the Arctic. Or three, 85% of the oceans have not been totally explored the depths. You said it all will get launched to the bottom.
Well, there's a number of things you could look at. You know, you looked at those. And of course, you think about animals. Certainly, there were animals in the sea that could eat things. Stapleton points out deposits have been unearthed where bones were found. Agate Springs, Sioux County, Nebraska. Discovered 1876. Bones of rhinoceroses, camels, and boars, so forth. Estimated the bones of 9,000 complete animals mixed with the remains of plants, trees, shellfish, or excuse me, seashells and fish. So you start seeing that they find these. How'd they get there? How'd you get all this stuff in Nebraska? And consider this, and again, there are those who believe that this was a regional flood in the, you know, Mediterranean, Black Sea, and of course I was reading, and again, I know I'm not naming all some of these, but I know I was reading in relation to to this, one of the commentators was commenting about the would it be the typography, I guess, the straight. Basically, you got a big bowl there. Basically, the way this particular one was commenting, and so was taking the position that possibly it was a regional flood. But you see something like this, and you see these things being found in Nebraska of all places. Nebraska is not a place that is any remotely close to the sea, is it?
It's just another great group that is go right now.
Well, I would argue that it would tend to suggest that certainly.
If, if it was local flood or whatever they want to say, then I can say that then the Bible's wrong because the Bible says all flesh died, all animals on the dry land died. Then it says it went over 20 feet of the top of this mountain. So when he says all flesh, he's not saying some flesh. He said all flesh.
Well, and I would agree with you on that. Now, the argument they would make, and that they would argue on that, and certainly there's some validity to this point, is that you see. Keep in mind, first of all, what we're reading is we're reading the translation of the original language, and sometimes you run into some issues where there's some issues with the translation as far as some things don't translate very well. Like we've talked about the word love. We use the word love. There's 4 Greek words in the New Testament. There's 4 Greek words that are used that all translate to love. So there's not that complete translation, and sometimes when it talks, and we'll get into this actually, see this actually later on, and I know this is a ways away, but in our lectureship this year, we're covering the prison epistles, and one of the topics won't be presented on the in the lectureship, but it will be in the book. Looking at there in Colossians about the gospel, what is it, verse 23, I think, the gospel being spread to all the world. Well, there's this debate. Is that talking about all the world, or is that talking about the known world as they talked about it? And so there's some back and forth on that, and actually looking at some of that, because actually that's one of the topics I'm looking at is the Greek word that they use there. There's some leeway on exactly what it means, but they would argue that, well, this is the above the mountains in that area would be the argument. Now, again, I don't hold to that view. I will say this, that the ark wasn't moving around a whole lot, so if you look at the mountains that we have over here, I don't think there would be a real concern about the ark hitting any of these mountains, the Rocky Mountains, because the ark wasn't anywhere over here. It was over in that area. But that being said, you're right, it does talk about all flesh being destroyed. And one of the problems that people run into in making this argument that it was a regional flood is that if it is a regional flood, why build the ark? Why send those animals there? Why do all that? Because literally all you would have to do is say, Noah, I'm going to flood this region here. I want you to go over what? Over to here. And don't worry about the animals. I'm just going to make sure some of them get over here. And again, as we're noting here, as Brother Stapleton had pointed out, you're finding these things in Nebraska. Well, Nebraska is not in that region. So there's a lot of issues with that. And so whenever I point that out about the language, original language and all that, just keep in mind those things. That's not to say that this was a regional flood. By no means do I believe it was. I believe that you study it, it is in fact a world flood. Got 2 people here, John.
I'm a Bible scholar, and I'm not a Greek scholar, so I'm gonna assume the people who translated it, I'm sure there's a few words that mean different things like love and stuff like that. The general concept is there, and he says upon the earth, it rained upon the earth. He didn't say upon the region, it says upon the earth. Then he says all flesh. I mean, we gotta go by what this says, and by studying it, it says that it was a global flood.
I believe that's what it is, teaching. You're right. Jim?
Mountains may have, because they're not spoken of much at all before, but mountains may have been formed by.
Well, there is
Think
some,
of the weight of the water, that much water. Rocks, rocks don't bend very well, they crack. Mountains are still changing every day. I have a world atlas printed in 1940 that gives the height of
Everest.
Everest of 22,022.
I think Everest climb increases a little, it's not drastically, but I think it's increasing in height every year.
Now it's 22,900 something. Now, did they make a mistake when they were originally doing this? Maybe. Has it increased in size? Yeah. But all of this is still being changed almost daily. So when we look at the world, we can't assume that the world pre-flood is what we see post-flood.
I would say it would be unlikely that it would be with the flood, because you see, again, it talks about the deep being opened up, and actually John mentioned about volcanoes, you know.
Yeah.
Is some of that occurring now because of what we read here? Because of the deep being opened up, and basically the earth opening up and water coming up out of the earth is the impression that I get from it.
And the flood is the only explanation for the Grand Canyon.
Unless you believe the world's like
Yeah.
billions of years old, which I don't.
I think we got earthquakes and stuff, water just through different things. You got the shift and tectonic plates, but let's tell it, Jim, before class, I don't want to get into it. I would think this is when the world is separated into continents, but like I told Jim, only thing that stops me from saying that for sure is how did the animals get around? Like like you said, to Nebraska and all them others, because it was still how to put it together and then separate. So I'm gonna say it happened after Babel is where I can put that because of the language barriers, different languages. But that's where I understood. But what I got from chapter 8 so far, I don't understand why you're a lot smarter than I am. Everybody talks how patient Job is. How patient he was. Noah sat here and built an ark for over 100 years, let's say, give or take, roughly. Over 100 years. Then he's in the ark for over, what, a year? In the ark. And then he sends out a dove, then a raven. You stay in your house for a year and see how stir crazy you get. He showed great patience until God told him to.
And another thing with the stations, you deal with all those people making fun of him. And stuff, and the Netflix stations.
We see here in, and we've got a lot that we talk about there and relates to all this and all good topics, and good points to be studied. But we don't want to spend all our time just discussing this. We note something in verse 20. And Noah built an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So Noah does what? He builds this altar. Why?
Where's you going?
Sacrifice to God, worship God. Thank you. Would certainly be included in there. Praising Him. Sue, you say something?
She's talking, yes.
Verse 20 says the Lord, verse 20, Noah built an altar
Uh-huh.
and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. The Lord sat in his said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake. Although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done.
So before we get to verse 21 there, we see again this idea that Noah, he comes off this ark and he sacrifices these sacrifices unto God. Now, keep in mind when Noah is living under the patriarchal system. This is obviously before the Levitical priesthood. Noah lives under the patriarchal system, so Noah is the head of his family. He's the priest, if you will, of his family. And what was the sacrifice? Now we think about, and you read in Leviticus, and of course there's different sacrifices, but certainly the idea of praise, worshiping God. What's another aspect of sacrificing these animals? Besides just praise. I mean, it ties into it, I guess, but do what? Forgiveness. To make atonement, we might say, to make things right with God, to make sure we're good. Everything is good here. We're in a right relationship with God, and He sacrifices all of these things. What'd you say, John? There you go. And Sue was reading there, and the Lord smelled this sweet savor that He says. He smelled this sweet savor. Why was it so sweet to God? Is it because it's burning flesh or burning?
It's what he is for.
Well, it's what God wants of him, wants of man at that time, of course. Not today. We aren't to sacrifice animals today, but it's what God has set forth. But it
shows obedience.
It's obedience. What God wants is Him obeying. Is pleasing to God because Noah is being obedient, but he got his heart, his mind set what? Toward God, right? He's focused where he needs to be. Now, as we're going to see as we go along, that doesn't necessarily stay the same. Noah kind of has some problems here afterwards. But here he makes these sacrifices. It's pleasing to God. And God says, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease.
Read that first part.
Which one?
When you get that. says, do not destroy.
How about his promise not to destroy the earth?
See, there's another argument, or I would say, things for global flooding, is because he puts a rainbow. He says he will not do it again. There's regional flooding. There's regional disasters. I mean, but there's never a global one. You know?
If this nomadic flood had been regional, then wouldn't the rainbow have been regional as well?
And look at the tsunami we just had. The view of the ocean that took out half of Japan. I mean, that wasn't regional.
I've gone on to a question, and in the burnt sacrifices, whether it's here or in the Mosaic sacrifice, did they skin them first?
Well, you see in some texts, and I'd have to go back and look up the various texts. I can't quote them off the top of my head, but you see in some instances where they divided them.
I understand that.
I don't know. Yeah. To be honest, I haven't studied that particular point, and it's not coming back to me one way or the other necessarily.
Well, kind of what brought this up is the smell of hair or feathers burning stinks.
Well, flesh. I've never smelt burning flesh per se, but I have read and heard enough to hear that it's an awful smell, a terrible smell to smell a, a person's flesh or I suppose an animal's flesh.
I mean, we can understand later why he used animals. I mean, he's still a little baffling, but I understand because of the blood sacrifice, but it's just a sweet aroma he's after. You could use herbs and stuff and get that sweet aroma. But like you said, it's ideal today, but we use blood sacrifice for the sin. Well, why do you use animals? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind as far as that goes, it's not the smell per se, as opposed to whether what the actual animal smells like burning. It's the idea of, and we see that imagery in the New Testament. We see that imagery being put forth. Something being a sweet aroma, sweet savor. King James Version says in relation to, and it's not per se that the burning flesh, the burning whatever smells good. But as to your question, Jim, again, I don't have an answer, but I'll see about doing some studying on that particular question, and look back at it a little bit more, because I don't remember it ever necessarily talking about them skinning it per se. You do see in instances where, again, they divide it. You see in instances where they burnt certain parts, certain things were to be discarded, and so forth. So depending on the sacrifice and all this. So I'll go back and I'll do some studying myself on that and look a little closer at that maybe next week.
Find out how to study, but just from what I know about animals and furries and things, I would say yes, they skinned it probably through that part of the way because they do this around the city and stuff. If you burn flesh stuff and hot eye and stuff, it makes such a bad odor that no one would want to be around it.
Well, keep in mind, things were a little different back then too than, well, I mean, it would, but I mean, it would be, you know, and they're out in the middle of the desert as far as it goes anyway, in a lot of these instances, especially, or the Israelites were now. They were out, and of course, at this point, when Noah comes off the ark, there are no cities, there are no people.
No,
It's
it
the-
does.
Yeah, so, anyway, we'll dig in, I'll dig into that and see if I can come up with an answer. I don't know if by your question, I'm assuming you haven't found an answer to that question, have you, Jim?
Well, I read one commentary that said, yes, they were skinned. But nobody else said yay, nay, or maybe.
Well, dig deep enough and you'll probably find some other that says they weren't, so.
Yeah,
And that may be it, and again, I'll do some research and all, but that may be one of those things that isn't spelled out one way or the other, so.
not that it makes much difference.
They certainly would have been told how to do it. If you assume that Adam and Eve made a sacrifice and then used the animal skins, you would suggest in that instance that they were. But that would have been, again, that's
Special purpose.
a little different, maybe. But God makes His promise. God makes His promise that He's not now. When He says He's not going to destroy the world, does that mean the world's never going to be destroyed? No. What is He talking about when He says, I won't ever do this again? Not going to destroy it by water. And in fact, what happens? When the earth is destroyed again, it's going to be by fire, but it's going to be different from this instance in another way, won't it?
Yeah, you need to compete with it.
It's going to be gone. Nobody's going to be waiting here. Nobody's going to be put in an ark or put in a safe place over here and then come back and rejuvenate, replenish the earth. What verse was that in chapter 1? 6? Flay, yeah. Well, and that certainly would give the impression of skinning. That because if you're flaying something, you're cutting strips off of it. So certainly there would be so I'm glad you looked that up there, John. That certainly again gives us the impression that that gives us an impression, of course, again, that they certainly in certain instances at least, and again that's the Mosaical age that they were doing this. And keep in mind different sacrifices, different times, the Levitical priesthood, they had multiple different, they had different sacrifices. And each one, depending on what the sacrifice was for, you offered a different animal, you offered it in a different way. I mean, they were burnt, they were sacrificed, but you took this out and you gave to the priest, or you took it yourself and you ate it.
What time of day?
And you had different times of days on different sacrifices. It's about time to conclude here. But we see Noah comes off the ark. He makes this sacrifice. God is pleased with the sacrifice. God promises that He is not going to, He's not going to flood the earth. And we're going to see now in this particular verse, we don't see the rainbow, but, we'll discuss that a little bit more, later and next week and maybe touch a little more on that as well on the skinning and all of that. Although again, we may not have a better answer than what John brought up just now. We'll pick up there in chapter 9 next week. And of course, for those perhaps listening, appreciate you being with us as well.